Robert Hastings thought he knew his life until a secret from his childhood was revealed. A secret stained by racism and family betrayals. When a stranger claimed his inheritance, the past struck with terrifying force. But the way Robert chose to respond shocked everyone. Let's start from the beginning. Robert Hastings stood by the window of his luxurious office, gazing at the cityscape that always reminded him of his achievements. His life seemed perfect. Massive contracts, powerful friends, elite clubs where he was respected as a self-made man. But even in his world of wealth and influence, there were those who craved more. After the death of his father, Jonathan Hastings, who built the entire empire from scratch, an invisible war began. Relatives he barely knew by name suddenly became his adversaries. In the days following the funeral, Robert tried to ignore the whispers and sidelong glances from the family members gathered at the mansion. But discontent rose to the surface like stagnant water. Cousins, uncles, and aunts, who had never cared about the family business, suddenly remembered they had a right to their share. Every evening at dinner, when family gatherings should have brought comfort during those tough days, the atmosphere grew tense. Robert noticed how they looked at him with envy and cold rage. They couldn't accept that his father had left most of the fortune to him, instead of dividing it equally. While his father was alive, the family stayed united under his iron hand. But now, his absence unleashed long repressed emotions and greed. Robert watched as these once close people transformed into predators, hunting for his wealth. Each day brought new sparks of conflict. One cousin claimed a part of the old family estate, another relative accused him of hiding income from one of the inherited projects. Robert felt he was on the verge of being at the center of a full-blown family scandal. At first, he thought he could handle everything through his lawyers. Being cautious and forward-thinking, he had long surrounded himself with the best attorneys and business advisors. The plan was clear. File lawsuits against anyone trying to challenge his right to the inheritance, and simply wait out the legal storm. Robert was confident he could protect his wealth and status without much trouble. Legal battles were nothing new to him. They were part of doing business. But his confidence began to erode with the appearance of one strange detail that seemed insignificant at first. It was a letter. No stamp, no return address, no sender's name. It was just lying on his desk when he returned from another meeting with his lawyers. Robert barely noticed it, but when he picked up the thin envelope, he felt a strange unease. Inside was just one sentence. "The secret of your childhood will destroy everything." The words, written in neat handwriting, stood out on the white paper like a mocking hint. At first, Robert dismissed it as just another trick from one of his enemies. Maybe someone was trying to mess with his nerves, knowing he was going through a tough time. Anyone could see that the inheritance issues were throwing him off balance. Robert easily set the letter aside, trying not to give it much thought. He was used to intrigues and manipulations in business, and this looked like another attempt to derail him. After all, every time someone threatened him, he responded with action, not words. But the more Robert tried to focus on his business, the more the thoughts of the strange letter returned. He wasn't someone who ignored warning signs. His entire life was built on foresight and analysis. And now, his intuition told him that this letter was more than just a childish threat. It touched on something deep, something he himself couldn't fully understand. After all, every mention of his childhood stirred vague unease within him. Robert's childhood was a mystery, even to him. His father, immersed in business, was rarely home. His mother seemed to live in her own world, distant from the family's problems. Robert grew up surrounded by luxury, but always felt a bit like an outsider in that world. He remembered being constantly surrounded by nannies and governesses, and how he was forbidden from asking too many questions about his family's past. His mother sometimes drifted into dark thoughts, but never shared them with her son. Robert had grown accustomed to the idea that some family secrets would remain untold, and perhaps he wouldn't have questioned them, if not for the mysterious letter. Questions began swirling in his mind. What if the letter hinted at something more than he could have imagined? What if his past, his childhood, held a secret that could change his entire life? As the first suspicions about a potential secret began to trouble Robert, he realized that mere guesses wouldn't be enough. The mystery surrounding his childhood demanded concrete evidence. He knew that the old family mansion, where important family documents were stored, likely held the answers he sought. This place had always seemed like a vault of the past to him. His father's library, where documents gathered dust for years, was off-limits to everyone except the head of the family. Robert dove into the archives with unprecedented determination. He had to sift through piles of old business contracts, reports, and letters left behind by his father. The first few days yielded no results, only increasing his inner tension. He examined faded photographs and old letters that, at first glance, seemed completely ordinary. Family albums didn't raise any questions either. Each photo captured moments of his perfect life. Countryside trips, family dinners, charity balls. Everything appeared as though their family was the embodiment of prosperity. However, one evening, after hours of fruitless searching, Robert stumbled upon documents that had been hidden among old business reports, almost as if someone had intentionally tried to conceal them. Opening a dusty envelope, he found a birth certificate, but to his surprise, the mother's name didn't match the name of the woman he had called Mom all his life. It was a completely different woman, whose name, Elizabeth Crawford, meant nothing to him. Furthermore, the attached photo of a young woman was not a picture of his mother. Robert froze for a moment. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that everything he believed in was a lie. How many times had he wondered about his mother's strange coldness? How many times had he seen her avoid questions about the past, retreating into her thoughts as if hiding something? But no one had ever given it much thought. Now, the pieces were falling into place. Perhaps this woman wasn't his real mother. Shock gradually gave way to bitter disappointment. How could his father hide the truth from him? Why had they lied to him all his life? Robert felt a sharp wave of betrayal, not just from his so-called mother, but from the man he had always idolized, his father. The realization that his life was built on an illusion plunged him into a pit of doubt. Who was he now? How could he trust anyone when his closest circle had deceived him? For several nights, Robert couldn't sleep, wrestling with the mounting questions and pain. He knew he had to confront the woman he had called his mother, but that conversation seemed impossible. He hesitated for a long time before taking that step, but the unbearable feeling of uncertainty pushed him to act. Robert decided it was time to learn the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. When he finally mustered the courage for the conversation, his mother was sitting in her living room, surrounded by the usual luxury. Her always impeccable appearance, cold demeanor, and aloofness, which had once seemed part of her personality, now irritated him. Robert wasted no time. His question was direct and sharp. "Who is Elizabeth Crawford?" For the first time in years, he saw fear flash across his mother's face. Her usually stony expression changed, and confusion flickered in her eyes. She tried to dodge the question, but Robert was relentless. In the end, she confessed. The story his mother told was far more tragic than he could have imagined. His real mother, Elizabeth, was a simple woman from a poor neighborhood with whom his father had a brief affair before he became wealthy. When she became pregnant, Jonathan Hastings, already on his way to success, couldn't afford to ruin his reputation and sacrifice his social standing. He offered Elizabeth money to leave and disappear from their lives forever, leaving the child to be raised by his new wife. The stepmother Robert grew up with was just part of a carefully constructed facade, a perfectly crafted mechanism to maintain the family's status. Robert had lived under the illusion that he was part of this family, never suspecting that all this time his real mother had been banished and forgotten. These words hit Robert like a lightning bolt. He couldn't believe it. But deep down, everything began to make sense. All the coldness and distance from his mother, her lack of interest in his life, and all the unclear moments that once seemed trivial now took on a new meaning. The shock of the revealed truth weighed heavily on Robert's heart like a stone. He became a different person. His life, once clear and understandable, was now nothing but a lie. Discovering that the woman he grew up with wasn't his real mother forced him to reevaluate not only his past, but his entire existence. Robert could no longer look at the family relics with the same pride as before. Every photograph, every painting in the house, once admired, now reminded him of deception and hidden secrets. Despite this, Robert decided to keep this information to himself. He understood that if this truth came to light, it would cause a scandal even more destructive for his already fractured family. His relatives, who were already on edge over the inheritance, would undoubtedly use this information against him. They would immediately question his right to the estate and the company, challenging his legitimacy as an heir. Robert couldn't afford this. He had no choice but to keep the secret, at least until he found a way to come to terms with his feelings. Yet, the secret began to eat away at him from within. Robert couldn't sleep at night, consumed by thoughts of how this lie had impacted his entire existence. He frequently found himself asking, "Who am I really?" His confidence faltered, and with it, his ability to act decisively. Every meeting with his relatives became a torment, as he had to hide his true emotions and continue playing the role of the rightful heir. But the secret wasn't destined to remain hidden for long. At a family gathering meant to discuss the next steps in managing the inheritance, the situation suddenly spiraled out of control. In the heat of the discussions, when tensions over the division of the estate were reaching their peak, the doors to the room unexpectedly flew open and a stranger appeared in the doorway. All eyes immediately turned to him. He was a tall man with a confident posture, his cold gaze sweeping across the room. Then he spoke the words that froze the air. "I am Jack Hastings, your half-brother, and I've come for my share." A heavy silence fell over the room. To Robert, those words sounded like a thunderclap in a clear sky. Jack? Half-brother? Everything Robert thought he knew about his father began to crumble. Just a second ago, it seemed like he had everything under control. He knew he was on the verge of a crisis, but this new claimant threw his entire life into chaos. Robert almost instantly realized that this man might be the very brother he had recently discovered through his research. The relatives didn't waste any time reacting. A torrent of accusations immediately erupted. They began shouting that Jack was a fraud, that he had no rights to the inheritance, and that he was merely an adventurer trying to grab a piece of someone else's fortune. Some even called for security to have him removed from the house. But Jack didn't move. He stood calmly, watching as this aristocratic family tore itself apart, each trying to protect their wealth. Meanwhile, Robert felt as though he was standing on a volcano, ready to erupt. He realized that all the attacks on Jack might be misplaced. Perhaps this man really was his brother, the one Robert had learned about in the old documents. Questions began swirling in his mind. If this was true, how long had his father kept this man's existence hidden? Why had Jack appeared now? And most importantly, what did he really want? But Robert faced a much bigger dilemma. He was standing at a crossroads, and his decision would determine the future of his empire and his family. If he supported Jack, he risked destroying his entire life. His relatives would immediately turn against him, and the courts would likely strip him of much of the inheritance. But if he stood against Jack, he would continue living a lie, one that he had been forced into since childhood. Robert was torn. On one hand, his role as the family's head demanded that he protect everything that rightfully belonged to him. He was ready to go on the offensive, but something inside him held him back. Perhaps it was his conscience, or perhaps it was the fear of uncovering a truth he wouldn't be able to ignore. As the wave of chaos and family disputes began to subside, Robert realized that the only way to put an end to this drama was through a DNA test. He could no longer live in doubt, and the longer he delayed this decision, the more the tension grew. Every day in the family home was filled with hatred and mutual accusations. Surrounded by relatives ready to tear him apart for control over the inheritance, Robert increasingly felt the need to learn the truth in order to resolve the situation and find peace within himself. He proposed a DNA test to Jack. This was the last chance to either prove or disprove the new claimant's assertions. Jack, without losing his calm, agreed without the slightest hesitation. This only heightened Robert's internal tension. If Jack were a fraud, he wouldn't have agreed so quickly or displayed such confidence. Robert was beginning to suspect that the truth might be more uncomfortable than he had imagined. but he could no longer back down. Several long days passed, filled with legal battles, meetings with lawyers, and family arguments. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the test results, as this would either mark the start of a new chapter in the family's life or bring an end to the entire battle. For Robert, these days were the most torturous. He hardly slept, consumed by thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew that the results of this test would change his life forever, whether Jack turned out to be his brother or not. When the envelope containing the DNA results finally appeared on his desk, Robert felt his heart tighten with anxiety. It seemed as though the moment of truth had arrived, and his entire life was inside that envelope. Tearing it open, he read the few dry lines. Jack was indeed his brother. This was the man his father had kept hidden all these years. The shock overwhelmed Robert. The truth he had been searching for was far more complex and painful than he could have imagined. Now, a new task lay before him, acknowledging Jack's rights to the inheritance. The entire family, upon learning the test results, was stunned. It seemed that no one could believe the truth, but it was undeniable. Despite all his inner turmoil, Robert was forced to admit defeat. Jack was indeed his half-brother, and he had every right to claim a portion of their father's fortune. However, for Robert, this fight over money and power began to lose all meaning. While his relatives continued to tear each other apart in their pursuit of wealth, Robert began to realize that he had been chasing the wrong things all these years. The truth about his past forced him to reassess his values and priorities. The money, upon which his life had been built, suddenly seemed meaningless. He realized that the real issues lay not in financial prosperity, but in the broken family bonds that his father had so cruelly severed. Reconciliation with Jack became not just an act of justice, but a step toward inner peace. Robert no longer saw his brother as a rival or a threat. In Jack, he saw a man who deserved his share of the inheritance, just as much as he did. Instead of continuing the fight, Robert chose to do what he could never have done before: relinquish a large portion of the fortune. Now, what mattered to him wasn't proving his right, but finding his own path, free from greed and the constant drive for control. Robert made the decision to donate a significant part of his wealth to charity. He no longer wanted to be part of a world where people were willing to betray each other for money. He realized that his future didn't lie in managing the empire, but in finding inner harmony and perhaps starting over. Keeping only a small portion for a modest life, he let go of his past ambitions and material attachments. Jack, the very man who had so unexpectedly entered his life, received what Robert had once desired for himself: the full control over the family empire. But for Robert, this no longer mattered. He was happy to have finally freed himself from the chains that had bound him for all these years. The shocking truth of the past, once a looming threat, became the very thing that liberated him from past illusions and resentments. Now, he could start a new life, unburdened by false expectations and the pressure of wealth. Robert had finally found his path to freedom, not through money, but through understanding and accepting who he truly was: